Fog that rolled over Blackthorn's graveyard in the autumn of 1890 was unlike any ordinary mist, clung to the crooked tombstones like a living thing, wrapping the churchyard in a suffocating shroud. Somewhere within that haze came the faint rustle of silk, though a gown were dragging across damp soil. The sound froze the blood of anyone who dared pass the iron gates at night. Villagers whispered it was the bride, Eleanor Whitcombe, the young woman who never made it to her wedding altar. Some said they had seen her pale veil drifting through the fog, her head tilted toward the church, as though still waiting for the vows that never came. Others swore they smelled roses and blood whenever she appeared, scent lingering long after the mist had thinned. At night, the bell of St. Michael's Church tolled once, though no hand pulled the rope. Villagers shuttered their windows, others dragging children away from the candlelight. The tavern keeper muttered a prayer he had nearly forgotten. No one dared look outside. They knew she walked again. Eleanor had been betrayed, humiliated, and left to die alone on the very day she was meant to be wed. Her body was buried beneath the cold earth of Blackthorn's graveyard. Her spirit never found peace. He said she rose in her torn white gown, lace soaked with rain and soil, her veil still clinging to her face. She did not wander without reason. She waited. She hunted. She sought the man who had ruined her life. 3 nights into the thick fog, something changed. A prince appeared in the mud just outside the graveyard gate, heavy, fresh, and far too large to belong to any bride. Villagers who noticed them crossed themselves quickly, whispering that someone had returned to Blackthorn. Deep within the mist, among the leaning stones, the bride's whisper carried through the night. At last, justice comes. Morning after the footprints appeared, the village square of Blackthorn buzzed with fearful whispers. Farmers leaned on their carts, the baker's wife clutched her apron tight, and the children, sensing the tension, kept unusually quiet. All eyes kept drifting to the graveyard hill, where the fog had lingered longer than it should. By noon, word had spread. Thomas Harrow had returned. The man once promised to Eleanor Whitcombe. The man who vanished on their wedding day, leaving her in disgrace. The man whose betrayal had driven her into a storm she never survived. Now, a decade older and marked by scars no one could explain, Harrow walked the muddy lanes of Blackthorn as though no ghosts haunted him. He carried a weathered satchel and the hollow look of a man who had traveled too far for too long. Villagers parted when he passed, muttering prayers beneath their breath. Not one dared welcome him back. That night, Harrow stood before the graveyard gate. The rusted iron creaked in the wind, and the mist slid between the bars like fingers reaching outward. He hesitated only once before stepping inside. His boots pressed into the fresh mud, leaving a trail that matched prints found earlier. Inside, the church bell groaned again, one deep toll, though the tower stood empty. And then came the whisper, soft, distant, carried through the fog like a sigh. Thomas Harrow froze. His chest tightened, his breath caught in his throat. He turned. The graveyard stretched empty around him, only crooked stones and the shadows of leafless trees. But the voice came again, closer this time. You left me. The mist thickened, curling around him. Then, from the far side of the graveyard, a shape began to form. White fabric, torn and muddied, trailing across the earth. A veil fluttered, though there was no wind. Thomas staggered back, his face pale, his lips trembling. The first time in years, fear gripped him wholly. Eleanor whispered. Bride did not answer in words. Instead, her head lifted slowly, and through the tattered veil, 2 eyes glimmered faintly, eyes that had not belonged to the living for a decade. Graveyard shuddered, and every stone seemed to groan with her rising. Fog swirled tighter, wrapping Thomas Harrow in a suffocating embrace. He stumbled backward until his spine pressed against a crooked headstone, its inscription eaten away by time. Breath came fast, clouding in the damp night air, but the figure kept advancing, slow, deliberate, unstoppable. Eleanor's gown dragged across the soil, leaving no foot. Her veil clung to her face as if stitched to her skin, its edges dripping with something darker than dew. Each step echoed louder than the last, though no sound should have carried in that mist. Thomas raised a trembling hand. I buried you myself. I prayed for your soul. The bride's voice rose like wind through broken glass. Prayed for yourself. Church bell tolled again. 2 hollow strikes, and the graveyard seemed to exhale. Dozens of crows burst from the trees, circling overhead in frantic spirals. Their cries drowned out his pleas as Eleanor stopped just before him. Slowly, she lifted her head. Through the veil, the faint outline of her face emerged, pale, hollow-eyed, lips bruised as if frozen in her final gasp for air. Thomas's knees buckled. I ran because I had no choice. They would have killed me if I married you. Confession tumbled out, jagged and desperate. Father's debts, the men he crossed, they came for me. I didn't abandon you. I saved myself. Bride tilted her head, veil swaying with emotion. What of me? The earth beneath the graves trembled. Soil split open around the headstones, as if the dead themselves stirred at her fury. From the cracks, pale hands clawed upward, skeletal, rotting, some still draped in tattered burial cloth. They reached for Thomas's boots, gripping, pulling. He screamed, thrashing against the grip of the dead. "Eleanor, release me." But she only leaned closer, her voice now a hiss that filled every corner of the fog. "You left me to rot. Now you shall rot with me." The mist surged, swallowing the graveyard whole. Thomas's cries were lost within it, muffled and fading. And then, silence. When the fog thinned, the graveyard stood still. The headstone Thomas had pressed against now bore a new name crudely carved into its surface: Thomas Harrow, 1858 to 1890, and at its base lay the imprint of a bridal veil. Following morning, villagers gathered near the graveyard gates, lured by the unnatural silence. Not a single crow cawed, no wind stirred the trees. Even the sea beyond the cliffs seemed stilled, as though waiting. Old Margaret, the herbalist, was the first to notice the new headstone. Her shrill cry carried across the square. "His name, Thomas Harrow, it's carved here." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some claimed they'd seen Thomas alive just the evening before, walking the lanes with his satchel. Now his grave sat among the others, the earth above it, freshly turned. Villagers crossed themselves, whispering prayers they had not spoken in years. At nightfall, no one dared go near the churchyard. Doors were bolted, shutters nailed tight. The fear only grew, because as the moon rose, a sound carried down from the hill. A woman's sobbing, soft at first, then sharper, jagged, like bones snapping beneath the weight of grief. Inside her cottage, Margaret stirred a pot of herbs and muttered incantations under her breath. She had lived long enough to know what others refused to speak aloud. Eleanor Whitcombe had not simply returned. She had become something else, and worse. Her vengeance was not yet complete. 3 nights later, second villager disappeared. Jonathan Bell, a young fisherman, failed to return from the tavern. The next morning, his boat was found drifting along the shore. Its wood bore deep gouges, as though something with nails or claws had scraped across it. By evening, a new grave appeared beside Harrow's, though no one had dug it. Jonathan's name was already etched into the stone. Panic spread like fire. Families fled Blackthorn under cover of darkness, wagons creaking down the road toward distant town. Yet for every villager who left, another grave appeared within the churchyard, marked with names not yet gone from the village. It was as though Eleanor's shadow reached beyond the grave, deciding the fate of all who had once judged. One night, parish priest, Father Alden, marched to the graveyard with a lantern in one hand and a crucifix in the other. His voice rang out against the fog. "God's grace, turn to your rest, Eleanor Whitcombe. You defile sacred ground." The lantern sputtered, fog thickened, and then out of the darkness the sound of a bridal hymn began to play. No instruments, no voices, just a haunting echo of a wedding march that never came to pass. The priest dropped his crucifix. His scream carried only once before silence reclaimed the hill. By dawn, his grave stood among the others. Villagers whispered a truth none could ignore. The bride's vow had become a curse. Eleanor would not stop until every last soul who had betrayed, abandoned, or doubted her justice lay buried in black. And the graveyard, once still, grew larger each night. By the end of autumn 1890, Blackthorn was no longer a village. It was a graveyard. Houses stood empty, doors swinging in the wind, shutters hanging loose. Livestock roamed freely, their owners long gone or claimed. Only the church bell tolled at midnight, though no hand remained to ring it. A traveler named Edward Crane arrived one frost-bitten evening, unaware of the cursed history. He had heard only whispers of a coastal village abandoned in fear, and he sought shelter for the night. With his horse tethered at the inn's rotting post, he wandered through the silence, crunch of leaves underfoot his only companion. Then he saw the churchyard. Graves stretched farther than his eyes could follow, some newly dug, others cracked open as if something had clawed from within. And in the mist stood a lone figure, a bride, veil torn but still clinging to her pale face. She swayed gently, as though listening to distant music only she could hear. Edward froze. He tried to call out, but his voice caught in his throat. The bride turned slowly, her hollow eyes fixing on him. Beneath the veil, her lips parted in a smile that did not belong to the living. She extended her hand. Nowhere, the sound of the wedding march rose again, faint at first, then louder, echoing through the village ruins. Edward stumbled backward, but the ground gave way. He realized too late he stood upon loose soil, grave, freshly dug. His own name was already etched into the stone. Edward Crane, 1862-1890. He screamed. Clawing at the dirt, unseen hands pulled him downward. Last thing he saw was the bride stepping into the grave with him, her gown spreading across the soil like a shroud. Earth closed. Silence returned. Years passed. Blackthorn vanished from maps, erased as though it had never existed. Sailors spoke of hearing church bells at night while passing the coast, followed by the faint echo of a woman's sobs carried across the water. No one dared to land. Yet the graveyard still grew. On storm-lit nights, locals claimed to see her, Eleanor Whitcombe, bride who waited in her veil, hand outstretched, seeking another partner to join her eternal dance in the soil. Her vow had been fulfilled, her justice eternal, but her hunger endless.